Now we're going to focus in on the human heart and how it pumps blood through our circulatory system. So remember, we have a 4-chambered heart with 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Notice how in diagrams of the heart, it's usually drawn as if you were looking at a person across from you. So their right side is drawn on the left and vice versa. As deoxygenated blood coming from the tissues enters the heart, it flows first into the right atrium. Oxygenated blood coming from the lungs enters through the left atrium. Oxygenated blood is then pumped from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and oxygenated blood is pumped from the left atrium to the left ventricle. From the ventricles, blood gets pumped into arteries. The aorta is the largest artery in the human body. Oxygenated blood is pumped from the left ventricle into the aorta, and then travels around to deliver that oxygen to the tissues. Deoxygenated blood is pumped from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. Remember, pulmonary means having to do with the lungs. So blood leaving through the pulmonary artery travels to the lungs to pick up oxygen. In between the atria and the ventricles, and between the ventricles and the arteries, are valves. They help prevent blood from flowing backwards each time it's pumped. The atrioventricular valves are on each side of the heart between the atrium and the ventricle. So that's where the name atrioventricular comes from. As blood is pumped out of the atrium and into the ventricle, the atrioventricular valve closes, so blood doesn't spill back into the atrium. The semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the arteries. So in the second part of the heartbeat, when blood is pumped from the ventricles into the arteries, the semilunar valves close to prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricles. When you listen to your heartbeat, you notice there are 2 beats, lub-dub, lub-dub. What you're actually hearing is these 2 sets of valves closing. So that first beat is the atrioventricular valves closing as blood is pumped from the atria to the ventricles. Then you hear the semilunar valves closing as blood is pumped from the ventricles to the arteries. Now we're going to talk about how blood travels through the heart and the rest of the circulatory system. There are 8 steps, but it will be easier to remember if you think about whether the blood is picking up or delivering oxygen at each step. Remember, this is a circuit, or really a system of 2 circuits, so we could start anywhere in the system. Let's start with blood that has delivered oxygen to tissues around the body and now needs to be pumped to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. This blood travels from the tissues to the heart, where it enters the right atrium. From the atrium, the deoxygenated blood is pumped into the right ventricle. The atrioventricular valve closes, and we have the first part of the heartbeat. Then the deoxygenated blood is pumped from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. The semilunar valve closes, and we have the second part of the heartbeat. Remember, this is deoxygenated blood, so we can remember that it must be going into the pulmonary artery because that's the artery that carries blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. The deoxygenated blood then reaches the lungs where it gets rid of carbon dioxide and picks up oxygen. So now we have oxygenated blood. Now that oxygenated blood is entering the systemic circuit to be delivered to the tissues. But remember, first it needs to go back to the heart to be pumped again. So the oxygenated blood returns to the heart, this time entering the left side, flowing into the left atrium. The oxygenated blood is pumped through the left atrium and into the left ventricle. The atrioventricular valve closes to prevent blood from flowing backwards. Again, that's the first part of the heartbeat. Then the oxygenated blood is pumped from the left ventricle into the aorta. The semilunar valve closes, the second part of the heartbeat. From the aorta, it travels around the body to deliver its oxygen. And finally, as blood delivers oxygen to the tissues, it becomes deoxygenated, and we're back where we started. Now pause and answer these next two questions. So what actually keeps our heart beating? The beats are controlled by a piece of modified muscle in the heart known as the sinoatrial node, or SA node. The SA node sends an electrical signal through the heart, signaling it to contract and beat. We can learn a lot about how the heart is functioning by measuring this electrical signal as it passes through the heart. We do this by placing electrodes on the skin to measure that electrical signal. The graph produced from this is known as an electrocardiogram. You may see it abbreviated as either EKG or ECG. Here's what an EKG looks like. It's actually a measurement of the strength of the electrical signal going through the heart. Each peak and valley corresponds to a particular part of the heartbeat. So each tall peak here is the start of a new heartbeat. Medical practitioners can use this to get a lot of information about how the heart is functioning. For example, if we measure the distance between peaks over time, we can measure the heart rate. But we can also see if those heartbeats are all the same length, so how regular the heartbeat is. An EKG can also be used to diagnose many different heart conditions. So let's talk about how the SA node actually controls the heartbeat. Each time the SA node sends an electrical signal, it causes both atria to contract, pushing blood into the ventricles. The atrioventricular valves then close to prevent that blood from flowing backwards. Then the atria relax, and the electrical signal travels down between the ventricles and bounces back up. This signals the ventricles to contract, pushing blood into the arteries. Again, we need to prevent blood from flowing backwards, so now the semilunar valves close. Then the heart relaxes and is ready for the next signal from the SA node to beat. Sometimes the SA node stops working as well, and the heart isn't beating as regularly as it should. When this happens, it can be replaced with an artificial pacemaker. An artificial pacemaker is a device that delivers regular electrical signals to the heart, just like the SA node usually does, to signal it to beat. Pause and answer this question.